Okay, let's be real. Third-party games simply aren't selling on Switch 2. Physical retail copies are selling terribly, if at all. Game keycards absolutely suck, and Nintendo is doing everything it possibly can to screw over third parties in order to make a quick buck. And even Nintendo's longtime biggest fans are staying away. Or at least all of that is the narrative that I see hopping around on social media. But is any of it actually true? Well, I am both a crazy shelf collector who has bought an insanely unnecessary amount of Nintendo games for about 3.5 decades. And I have over 2 decades of experience in publishing a huge amount of retail entertainment products to major retailers, including Blu-ray, DVDs, and books. And I'm also a third-party developer of indie games, with multiple games lined up for Switch 1, and I'd previously planned on releasing them on Switch 2, but I'm actually having some doubts. So I think I'm in a good position to break all this down from every single possible angle. But wait a minute. Oh my god, it's Stevie Richards! If you're listening on Spotify, that won't make any sense. But for those of you watching on YouTube, you'll have seen the thumbnail. And I want to say quickly, I've absolutely no beef with RGT85. I briefly interacted with him way back in 2017, and he seems like a chill guy. So I respect his retro credentials and knowledge too. But I already recorded this entire episode a couple of days ago, edited the video, started uploading it, and then I saw that he'd uploaded a video on the same subject, and actually now 2 videos because he got some pushback from his first one. And it's interesting to me because he talks about interactions and what people are saying about this on Twitter, or X, and X is exactly what Twitter is to me nowadays, as I haven't bothered to log in for several years now. If you know me, by the way, you know that if anyone so much as mentions Twitter, I have to chime in and say that Barack Obama follows me on Twitter, which stems all the way back from when I was touring with D12 at the time of his campaign, and we were asked about the election on the radio. And yeah, for those of you that only know me through this podcast, a whole ton of very weird lore just opened up, but that's for another day. And Obama, if you're listening, I'm sorry that I haven't logged in for so long and I haven't blessed your feed with my amazing takes on why the Sega 32X is underrated. Again, something I think RGT would agree with, as he published a rather snazzy book on the subject. Look, I like RGT, but these 2 videos that he made have indeed created more work for me because I decided to scrap the previous attempt and record all over again. Now with the hindsight of knowing what people are saying on Twitter and what the main narratives are. Honestly, a lot of this stuff that I thought was obvious, but evidently not, and why I think that RGT made some good points, but also where I think he might be wrong or needs some more context, especially because I'm a game dev myself, and also I have that distribution and publishing retail experience. So, for legal reasons, the thumbnail is a parody and not intended to represent anyone, either living or dead, and any resemblance is completely coincidental. But just as Ryu in Street Fighter 2 taught us back in the day, you have to defeat Shawn Long to stand a chance. And Shawn, I know you likely won't see this, but just on the off chance that you do, because some asshole sends it to you trying to create beef, I hope your stepdad is doing better, man. And I've recently been through a similar thing in my family, so I know what that's like. All love to you and yours, mate. And I will put the GoFundMe link in the description and pin comments to hopefully help with the medical bills. So everyone go, please check that out. Thank you. So we're going to get right into the meat and potatoes of this spicy meatball of a mixed metaphor. So let me just quickly read the podcast introduction and we can jump right into things. I have no idea why I turned into Alex there. Hello there, lovely people. Welcome to Daily Switch 2, a podcast covering everything related to the Nintendo Switch 2 with at least one new episode uploaded per day to YouTube, Spotify, and your favorite major platforms. My name is Sam, and I've been a gamer since the 1980s. I've worked in the entertainment industry since I was a teenager, including as a games journalist, producer of gaming documentaries and shows, and I'm even programming multiple indie video games, including 4, which will be released on the Switch, and hopefully Switch 2 addendum in this video. So be sure to subscribe and follow the show for the world exclusive news on those as they drop. However, I'm a gamer and Nintendo fan at heart, and this podcast is purely a passion project for me to talk about the stuff that interests and excites me about this new system. It's not monetized or funded by any entity. It's completely unofficial and unbiased, so that I can give my full, frank, honest opinions. So, if you want to support me or just find out the best places to get these free daily episodes, or to join our free members area where you can talk to me and leave suggestions and take part in monthly free giveaways to win official Nintendo prizes, all links are in the bio and at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. Thank you so much, and back to the episode. So, what is it specifically that we're going to be talking about today? Well, several things, but what it all boils down to is Nintendo making some frankly baffling decisions which are hurting general consumers, passionate collectors who are longtime fans, and third-party and indie devs. And as I said, I definitely fall into pretty much all of those categories, except being a casual consumer. So this is close to my heart. We're going to cover game keycards, code in a box, only 64GB cartridge sizes, minimum runs, digital distribution, and eShop issues, and how Nintendo setting such high prices for their own games and accessories is indirectly damaging third parties, which will inevitably end up damaging the long-term success of the console if third parties stay away, like they largely did with the N64, GameCube, Wii U, and even the Wii and Super Nintendo to some extent. So let's set the scene. The Switch One has been a runaway success. It's possibly the best-selling console of all time. Sony recently put out a very vague figure about the PS2, but at the very least, the Switch One is Nintendo's biggest-selling console ever, at over 150 million units. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that that isn't 150 million unique people that own a Switch. For example, families quite possibly buy more than one. Parents might want to play. Each kid might want their own system, especially when you've got things like Animal Crossing, which was extremely unfeasibly popular around about 2020 for reasons that we won't specify so early because of the YouTube algorithm. And that particular game only allowed one save per system. So if you had, multiple family members and multiple children who wanted to play, you needed multiple systems. And even if you're just a single person buying a system, there have been multiple variations. They made a second edition with better battery life, and then we had the Switch Lite, which was in some ways nicer and more portable. It's my favorite way to play the Switch One portably, at least. And then the Switch OLED model, which obviously had many upgrades. Plus, there's crazy collectors, and I put myself in that kind of category, who buy every variant. All different color versions, limited editions, Zelda versions of the console, Mario versions of the console, Animal Crossing versions of the console. So, yeah, the 150 million units doesn't mean there's 150 million players, but Mario Kart has sold something like 30 million copies, I think, so we can safely assume that conservatively there's at least 50 million unique Switch One players that exist. Whether they're all still playing is debatable. I think many people fell off over time. The Switch 2 is arguably released far later than it should have been. But as well as being a huge hardware success, it's been an enormous sales success for games as well, which is far from a given when a console is successful, especially for Nintendo. For example, they previously had problems shifting games for the Wii. The Wii was their biggest selling home console, and was the biggest selling home console of that generation, beating out the PS3 and the Xbox 360. But software sales were dismal, especially after the first couple of years, because many of the people buying the console were just casual consumers, people who didn't usually play games, and they bought it specifically because they wanted to use Wii Sports, which obviously was the pack-in, or maybe Wii Fit for working out at home, doing yoga, that kind of thing. And maybe if you were lucky, you might buy some Mario Kart, or Just Dance was very popular on the system, for casual people to play at kind of house parties, when you invite people around, children's birthday parties, or, friends coming around for drinks and a pizza or whatever. Good multiplayer system, but if that's all that you want the system for, that doesn't translate to enough software to sustain a console. Nintendo have previously had problems selling third-party games on multiple of their platforms. In fact, after the NES, which was a huge system for third parties, pretty much every console after that has had some kind of issue with third parties, either at the beginning or as time went by. But this wasn't the case with the Switch 1. Quite the opposite, so it really bucked the trend for Nintendo. The Switch 2 console itself, which has only been out for, 2 weeks now, by all accounts, it's been an unqualified major success in its launch window for the hardware, at least. So I'm going to read a quote from Matt Piscatella. RGT used a different quote from Piscatella, and we will get on to that later. But what Shawn didn't give much context to, not blaming him, but perhaps he thought people in his audience would know this or that it didn't matter. But for context, I think I should, say why he's worth listening to. Piscatella is the executive director of Circana, who are a data analyst company for the video games industry. And many, many people don't like video games analysts because anybody can call themselves that. In fact, any guy who just goes on social media and regularly enough talks about industry news, the non-gaming journalists are quite lax in who they will accept as an expert. I know this personally because I myself have been asked in major newspapers and TV news and things like this to speak as an expert on the games industry, as have several of my friends who are like me, just YouTubers and game fans. But Piscatella and his Circana company works with massive retailers, including Walmart, which is probably the biggest physical sales of games in America, and Amazon, which is probably the biggest digital sales of games, at least by digital I mean it's a website where people can buy games, predominantly physical, but and also they work with games companies including Activision, Blizzard, and Ubisoft. So you don't really get much bigger than that. Previous to that, he was director and US video games analyst for the NPD Group. He spent over 7 years as director and then vice president of sales planning and analysis for Warner Brothers Entertainment. And right before that, nearly 4 years at Activision, rising in the ranks from analyst to director of business intelligence. So, yeah, in theory, this guy should know exactly what he's talking about and certainly does have industry insights from major retailers and publishers, which other people might not necessarily have access to. So the first quote that we're going to give from Piscatella is this. Nintendo Switch 2 enjoyed a record-breaking launch in the US market. Here are just a few fun facts from its debut from Circana's retail tracking service. Nintendo Switch 2 set an all-time launch week unit sales record for video game hardware in the US, with over 1.1 million units sold during the week ending in June the 7th, 2025. Excludes sales from the My Nintendo store, so the numbers are actually even higher, because you can assume a decent amount of people would have bought directly from Nintendo. That was an addendum that I added. Carrying on the quote, the record was previously held by the PlayStation 4. Interesting. 79% of US Nintendo Switch buyers also purchased Mario Kart World, either physically or as part of the Mario Kart World Switch 2 hardware bundle. The top 3 best-selling Switch 2 physical video games sold in the week were units: 1. Mario Kart World, 2. Cyberpunk 2077, 3. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom Nintendo Switch 2 edition. Now, what does the units mean there? I assume what that means is that you're counting the top 3 by how many units sold, not by how much money was spent on them. However, Mario Kart World and Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom are both $80 games, which is the most expensive games. In fact, they are the 2 most expensive games currently available for the system. And Cyberpunk is a $70 game, which is the most expensive tier of third-party games so far. There's been no $80 third-party games so far. So I don't think he needed to specify units there, because it would be exactly the same if we included the price rather than the units. So just taking that quote from Piscatella at face value, you'd assume that this would all be incredible news for third-party devs, indie devs, and the like. Obviously, the Switch 1 is a huge success, but a bit long in the tooth. Even Nintendo have trouble with their most recent first-party games on the Nintendo Switch 1 to have them play reasonably without frame pacing and stuttering and resolution dynamic changing and all kinds of things that make you wish it had a little bit more power. So the Switch 2 is essentially just an iterative version of the Switch 1, but more powerful, which everyone wanted. So everyone is sure that the Switch 2 will be a massive success, and all third parties are climbing over themselves to put their games out. It should have been an easy slam dunk for Nintendo. In fact, I was interviewed a year or two ago for a different podcast and asked what I wanted from Switch 2 as a dev and as a fan. And I said literally, basically, what it is. I didn't want Nintendo to try and reinvent the wheel and come up with some crazy new control scheme or gimmick, multiple screens, 3D virtual reality, something that we haven't even thought of. No, I wanted basically Switch 2, a more powerful version of the Switch 1. It's fully backwards compatible, can play Switch 1 games, preferably plays the Switch 1 games nicer and has better frame rates and maybe higher resolution in certain games. But the most important thing was that it was powerful enough to be able to play pretty reasonable versions of current gen games so that third parties wouldn't really have any problems releasing games on the Switch 2 that they were also releasing on the PS5 and the Xbox Series. Also, I wanted PC games to be easily convertible across, and I wanted it to be fully backwards compatible to encourage as many players of the Switch 1 as possible to upgrade to the Switch 2. Because as a developer myself, do I want to release a game on a brand new system that only has a small current user base, or do I want to release it on an old system but there's maybe 60 million people out there with units in their hands? You would think it would be easier to sell more copies to those 60 million people, but in the launch window of a new console, people are more likely to buy games for that new console because they, want to try out their shiny new hardware. We saw that with, for example, brand new 3DS games tanking in sales after the Switch. And every time there was a new 3DS game announced, there was outcry of, okay, yeah, it looks great, but I don't want to buy a 3DS game. I want to buy a Switch game. Why didn't they release this on Switch? My prime example of that would be Yoshi's Woolly World, or Yoshi and Poochie's Woolly World, I think it was called. I love Yoshi's Woolly World on the Wii U. I think it's one of the greatest platform games that Nintendo have ever made, and that's saying something because they've made excellent platformers over the years, many of the all-time classics, obviously, but it's one of those games that's sadly stuck on the Wii U. Almost every big game on the Wii U got a conversion to the Switch 1, but for some reason Yoshi's Woolly World hasn't, although there are strong rumours that the Switch 2 will get a version. But having the Switch existing as a console, but then having the port or the re-release that everybody was wanting be released on the 3DS, and in some ways therefore being downgraded because of the lower resolution, etc., it seemed to defy logic. And although there was a very large install base for the 3DS, the last few games that released on it really didn't sell very many copies. So as a developer, you've got to think about that when you're releasing a new system. Do you want to release on the Switch because it has a larger, in theory, customer base? Do you want to release on the Switch 2? Because it's the latest and greatest, and many of the old customers from the Switch 1 will have upgraded to the Switch 2, so they'll be wanting to buy only Switch 2 games. Or, if it's backwards compatible, can you release for the Switch 1, but market it heavily as this plays really well on the Switch 2? That's, something which was a heavy consideration for me, and as I say, unfortunately, there's some issues with third parties, but we'll get into that later. For now, looking at the Switch 2 games themselves, despite the console itself selling around 4 million units in its first week, and that's including the 1.1 million in the US, but 4 million worldwide, the game business published an article saying third-party games on Nintendo Switch 2 are selling disastrously. Quote, one third-party publisher characterized the numbers as beyond our lowest estimates despite strong hardware sales. End quote. So even though the system has sold far better than expected, the third-party games are selling far lower than expected, meaning that the problem is even larger than it would at first appear. In the US, at least, over 80% of the Switch 2 software sales came from physical retailers. So people walking into a shop to pick up games. Presumably at the same time as the console, because in general, people don't do that anymore. Other than on launch days or special occasions, even people who collect physical copies of games rather than buying digitally, they tend to buy via Amazon or some other online retailer to get them posted to their house. But 80%, over 80% of Switch 2 software sales came from physical retailers. So that means that people aren't necessarily ordering physical games online. They aren't pre-ordering games or even buying games other than whatever they chose to pick up at the exact same time as the console. And that is a huge problem because, of course, when you buy the console, you are spending a lot of money up front in one go, and you can't really afford to buy many games at the same time. In fact, I'd wager that most people only bought the console and Mario Kart bundle. Piscatella's 79% stat includes the bundle. So that means that 21% of people that bought a Switch bought the console only, without Mario Kart. Because Piscatella says 79% of people bought Mario Kart, but that includes the bundle. So 21% of people that bought a Switch bought the console only, without Mario Kart, and didn't buy the physical copy of Mario Kart. So does that mean that 21% of people that bought a Switch on day one have no intention of buying Mario Kart? The only major launch title exclusive, they have literally no interest in it, but they still decided to buy the very expensive console right away in the first week? For what? Just to play their Switch 1 games with slightly nicer Joy-Cons, but a slightly worse screen than the OLED model? I know some people will call me out on 1080 versus 720 thing, but that's a whole other video. The screen is not good. It's not terrible at all, but it's not good in inverted commas, and I've promised a whole other video on why, and again, how it actually affects my personal decision to make games for the system as a developer. There's issues with it that we don't have time to get into here, but if you are interested in the tech side of things, subscribe, as I'll be going over it in a lot of detail, and not just the Digital Foundry kind of way, but from a developer perspective with some stuff that I haven't actually seen anyone else talking about. But then again, as I said, I don't use Twitter anymore. So it seems more likely that a large amount of the 21% buying the console without Mario Kart probably wanted to buy Mario Kart, but simply couldn't immediately afford it because of the elevated cost of the system. Some others were probably scalpers, hoping that there would be retail shortages and they could buy the cheapest possible version of the system, then add a massive markup. And while I don't want to knock the hustle of someone desperately trying to find a way to make money in this current economy, I'm personally pretty glad that Nintendo have actually manufactured enough consoles so that there isn't a stock shortage and you can basically walk into any retailer and buy one at RRP. I understand the people who are laughing at the scalpers losing money. I saw a clip of Pat Contry of CU Podcast looking up real time on eBay and finding over 10,000 Switches for sale from scalpers on eBay in America, and many of them were actually losing money for the scalper by the time you factor in things like eBay's fees and PayPal fees and postage, because people don't want to pay more than retail, because you can basically walk into any retailer and buy one at RRP. So for those people who actually did buy Mario Kart, that 79% stat, either in the bundle or, like me, wanting a physical version to put on their shelf, it's a safe bet that many of those people didn't buy any other games. We don't have officially released figures of how many physical or digital games have been sold. Analysts like Piscatella have data that would at least allow a rough estimate of this, but are being very cagey about making any statements. I believe because it paints a very, very dark picture. But we can assume with a reasonable level of certainty that if 21% of people aren't even buying the pack-in game, which is considered by most to be the only must-buy, in inverted commas, game at launch, there's going to be a large amount of people that bought 0 games just wanting to secure their console in case of shortages, use it in the meantime to play their Switch 1 titles, and choose to buy Switch 2 games at a later date, maybe on their next paycheck or once they've recovered. They will never financially recover from this kind of thing. There are actually several very likely and completely valid reasons that people might buy the console with no games, and I'll cover those later too. Some people will want to argue that a lot of people either don't like Mario Kart or have been put off by the negative reviews online, so instead bought the Switch 2 to play other games. Perhaps they really want a portable version of Cyberpunk, No Man's Sky, Sonic X Shadow Generations, or even the more niche titles like the multiple RPGs, strategy games, life sims, etc. And that sounds kind of convincing. But let's look at the quote again. Over 80% of software sales come from physical retailers. So that means less than 20% of people have bought any digital games in the first week, because it's over 80% of software sales were from physical retailers. And in general, physical retailers don't sell digital download codes. Less than 20% of people bought any digital games in the first week, not even first-party games. And that completely tracks with my theory that 21% that didn't buy Mario Kart actually bought no games at all. To reiterate, we don't know the exact numbers, but many people, a significant margin, bought only the console with 0 games. If we assume that the US market is reflective of trends around the whole world, that's 4 million console sales. That 4 million console sales means that around 800,000 people, close to 1 million, bought a console but with no games. Again, 0. That's insane. I don't think that has ever happened before, not in the history of video games. Certainly not for a major console. Obviously, you have handhelds that play bootlegs and things like that, but not for a major retail release console. Again, I can posit why that might be the case, and we'll talk about it later. But for now, let's look at the 3.2 million people that did buy at least one game. At least one game, very much in inverted commas, because buying a game is somewhat of an exaggeration. I'd wager a huge amount of that 3.2 million people just bought the bundle with Mario Kart and stopped there. So for now, we don't have figures, and it seems like they're being held back to not damage future retail and sales prospects too badly with negative publicity. Shouting from the rooftops that the Switch 2 has record console sales means that more people are going to want to buy, having a positive outlook on the system or having FOMO. I'd guess that that's a big reason that many industry people have been strongly speaking out against anyone daring to criticize Mario Kart World 2. Despite the obvious flaws and lukewarm fan reception that we're seeing from aggregates. People in the industry want the Switch 2 to be a success, to continue the good times they've been having with the Switch 1. And to be clear, I'm in the industry, and I want that too. And I want it as a fan. But I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to sugarcoat. I recently uploaded a full podcast episode to Spotify and YouTube, split into 2 parts, where I did a full rundown and basic review of every one of the 25 Switch 2 launch titles. And the feedback to it has been pretty universally positive overall. But in order to try and ride the algorithm a bit and get a few more people to check out the full-length episode, I also made several clips where I cut out the portions for specific games and released them on YouTube. And in the video on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I've had some fairly vocal pushback from people that seem upset that I would dare to criticize Nintendo. Even though in that same short clip, I state that in my opinion, they are 2 of the best games of all time. And even though I think the Switch 2 editions are overpriced, if you have never owned the games before, there is still good value for money when compared to other forms of entertainment, like buying a movie ticket, Blu-ray, eating out, going bowling, or whatever. But it seems that to certain fans, even this mild criticism was too much, and some people assume I'm a Nintendo hater or I want Switch 2 to fail. Let's be logical for a second, okay? I am the host of the Daily Switch 2 podcast. As I say in every introduction, this is not monetized in any way, and I am not sponsored or affiliated with Nintendo or any other commercial entity. It's just me, sat in my room, making these episodes, recording, editing, uploading at great expense in not just hours every day, but for literally zero income and a pretty huge cost in buying a console, games, and accessories to cover in the show. Why am I doing it? Well, perhaps in the future it might grow and start to cover its own costs, but that's a long way off, if ever. It will probably take at least 6 months to get even monetized by YouTube, if that ever happens. And while I do have a Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee account set up, right now I haven't had a single donation, and I don't expect to anytime soon. I'm not e-begging. If you're listening to this, please don't take it as me trying to ask for donations. No. Right now, in this economy, and with the highly elevated price of the console and games, I'd actually encourage you to save your money. If you want to help, just subscribe, drop a like or a comment. There is a completely free tier on my Patreon, which again actually costs me money to run because I thought it would be a fun thing to do to buy a ton of little official Nintendo Gacha prizes and give them away to members. If you want to join for free, it is linktree/dailyswitch2, linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. But again, I don't bring this up to draw attention to this channel or e-beg or anything else. In fact, I haven't even brought up any of this in previous episodes, as I actually think it's kind of gross to talk about this stuff at all. Sure, I put links in the description, the pinned comments, but you've never heard me ask for donations, and I never will. You can hold me to that. I'm just glad that people are listening. The only reason I'm mentioning it now is it's baffling to me that people are somehow getting the opinion that I hate Nintendo and I want Switch 2 to fail. If that was the case, why would I have chosen to make this podcast, make these YouTube videos, spent countless hours per day working on it all by myself? This is my hobby, and it's an expensive one at that, but I'm doing it because I love Nintendo, and I've been so excited for the Switch 2, and I want to create a space where I can talk endlessly about how hyped I am for all the latest first-party games. Anyone who saw my coverage of the Donkey Kong Bonanza Direct can't possibly have thought that I'm anything else but a huge Nintendo fan, an almost obsessive level of collecting Nintendo games and systems since the 80s, and beyond excited for the future of Switch 2. And on top of this, as a games dev myself, why on earth would I want the system to fail? I need the console to be a success so that my games for it have a chance of selling. So the idea that I want the Switch 2 to fail is preposterous to me. I'm sorry if all of that sounded like a rant. I felt myself getting passionate there, or even could be interpreted as self-advertising or self-aggrandizement. That's not the intention. I just can't believe that some of the comments I got after I dared to say that $80 is too much for a re-release of Tears of the Kingdom, or Breath of the Wild should have included the DLC on the cartridge. How dare I? I know. Fake Nintendo fan, Sony fanboy, whatever else people implied that I was in the comments. It's insane. But yeah, rant aside, 3.2 million people bought at least one game. Let's look into that. Looking back at his quote, it says, the top 3 best-selling Switch 2 physical video games sold in the first week were Mario Kart World, number 1, Cyberpunk 2077, number 2, number 3, Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo Switch 2 edition. Again, we weren't given quotes beyond that by Piscatella, and I've already at least implied that I think he's misleading by omission on purpose to paint a rosy picture with multiple of his quotes, including one that is flat out ridiculous to the point that it's basically wrong, and I'll get to that later. But let's look at those 3. Mario Kart World at number 1. It's not surprising that it's the number 1 game on the system. That was a given, but he specified physical. And that's a pretty bad sign, actually. Because surely the majority of people that bought Mario Kart World actually bought the Switch 2 bundle that came with the game digitally. Sure, there are crazy fanboy shelf collectors like me that paid $80 to get a physical copy, but the vast majority of people can be assumed to have bought the bundle in order to save $30 on what is already a very expensive system with extremely cynically overpriced accessories. I did another episode where I reviewed every officially available accessory, many of which people will consider essential, especially when buying for their kids, like a carry case with screen protector, a camera for playing online, memory cards, extra Joy-Cons or a Pro controller for multiplayer, an extra dock so the kids can play on the TV in their bedroom while the parents are watching TV in the lounge. Without fail, every accessory that I covered was not bad quality. But with no exceptions, they were all priced at least 30% higher than what I would have expected and 50% higher than what I'd actually consider good value. So yeah, with the price of entry being that high, you can't tell me that many people chose to pay the extra $30 to get the physical edition of Mario Kart. But the game I assume that not many people bought is the number 1 selling physical release. It's not a good sign. Number 2 selling physical release is Cyberpunk, and in a way I don't think that will surprise too many people. It's by far the most anticipated of the third-party lineups, and the one that's been getting the most attention in advertising, etc. Even people who usually only play first-party releases of colourful, cartoony games on their Nintendo might be interested to buy Cyberpunk in order to really show off what their new system can do from a technical perspective. It's a visual showpiece for absolute sure. And for those that care, it's one of only 2 third-party games in the launch lineup where the full game is on the cartridge. One of only 2. We'll get into the game keycard situation soon enough, but it's certainly something that will have persuaded a decent percentage of people to buy over other third-party AAA releases, which will require a 20 to 60 gigabyte download before you can play, and eat up a large chunk of the relatively small 256 gigabyte built-in memory. Again, we'll cover the keycard and digital situations later, but for now, let's say it's a factor in Cyberpunk being a success to some extent. Remains to be seen exactly how many people care about this issue, but I'd wager it's a decent chunk. Piscatella's statement ends at number 3, which is Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo Switch 2 edition. It's interesting to note that Tears of the Kingdom outsold Breath of the Wild, especially because it's $80 compared to Breath of the Wild at $10 less. But realistically, Breath of the Wild is a game that is, 8 years old or more? And diehard Nintendo fans may even have already bought and played it on both the Wii U and the Switch. And again, I'm one of those crazy people that buys every single version of every first-party game, even re-releases, and the same game on multiple systems. I just like to collect them. What I'd actually wager is that because many people didn't actually buy Tears of the Kingdom the first time around, it's easy to forget nowadays, but it was a controversial game at launch. Firstly, because it was their perception that it was just a glorified DLC for Breath of the Wild. Personally, I don't think that's fair or valid, but I can absolutely see how it can be argued, especially at the time, and if you don't actually play the game and you just look at trailers and the like. But the second big controversy, and the reason many stayed away, was it was Nintendo's first and only game to release at $70 on the Switch 1. $10 higher than the previous maximum. Combine that with the perception that it should have been DLC, and the fact that some people had a bit of Breath of the Wild fatigue, having played it for hundreds of hours, and Tears of the Kingdom didn't seem quite as tempting to a good amount of fans. But now that the dust has settled, now that it's well established that it's a good game and significantly different to the previous title, there will perhaps be a number of people who never bought the game on Switch 1 but are willing to give it a chance on their shiny new Switch 2. It would be interesting to know just how many copies it sold, though as it's below physical Mario Kart, despite that being the pack-in bundle, so little reason to buy it physically, and even below the third-party game Cyberpunk, which is in a genre that wouldn't typically be played by Nintendo games or by Nintendo's core customer. It's safe to say that the numbers aren't enormous. We know that only 3.2 million bought a game of any kind, including the bundle. That's what makes it so painful. What's a reasonable number of people to assume that they chose to spend $30 more just to get the cartridge for Mario Kart? 20% of people? 20% of people who bought Mario Kart chose to pay $30 more rather than get the reduction by having it bundled in? I honestly think that's being extremely generous. It's probably closer to 5%, but let's be very, very generous and say 20%. So that would be, at a maximum, around 640,000 copies of Mario Kart sold worldwide, separately. And then a number smaller than that for Cyberpunk. Smaller still for Tears of the Kingdom, and even smaller for Breath of the Wild. So despite Piscatella's statement stopping at a top 3, Game Business tells us a little bit more. Quote, 62% of physical sales in the US were first party, not including Mario Kart World bundles. Holy crap. So yeah, we know that it's not including the bundle, as that's a physical game anyway. Physical sales. We'll get on to digital sales later, but 62% first party physical is quite telling because there are barely any first party physical games. We have Mario Kart, again, likely to have sold less than 640,000 copies. That is the absolute maximum, and it's quite possibly closer to 200,000. But let's be generous and say 640,000 copies. The only other first-party developed exclusive game is Switch 2 Welcome Tour. But A, that is not a real game, and B, it's digital only, so it doesn't count in that 62% of games being first-party. So we have the 2 Zelda games, re-releases of older games, and we know that they sold even worse than the physical Mario Kart and Cyberpunk, a third party. And for whatever reason, Piscatella decided to mask whether Breath of the Wild was 4th place or embarrassingly outsold by another third party. But if I had to guess, though, I'd say it was in 4th place, close behind Tears of the Kingdom. And the reason it's not being promoted heavily is that it actually looks better for the industry as a whole if we don't make it obvious that third parties aren't selling very well. So having a third-party game named in between Mario Kart and Zelda in the top 3 looks great, until you realize it's only the physical copies of Mario and Zelda, and both of them have reason to suspect that they didn't sell very well in reality. But other than that, what could be in that 62% of physical sales that were first-party? Well, there's only one more title, Bravely Default. If that's even counted, we don't know whether they're counting that. We assume so, because Nintendo are publishing it. But it's not a Nintendo game, it's a Square Enix title that for some reason is published by Nintendo. Do we really think that Bravely Default 2 HD, whatever it is shifting hundreds of thousands of units at retail when it's a relatively niche RPG, JRPG, with hardly any name recognition, and it's an HD remake of an old 3DS title? Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm sure that it's a good game. I've heard some people raving about it, actually. But they were talking about how much they loved it many years ago on the 3DS. I can't imagine it's going to be a huge seller on the Switch 2, especially not at launch, where, don't forget, around 20% of people didn't even buy one single game. And that's counting digital sales too. I promised earlier that I'd cover why I think that is, so let's cover that next. I've already talked about how expensive the console is and how massively overpriced most of the accessories are, including many that parents would probably consider essential, in inverted commas, purchases when getting a system. So basically, at the time of buying, a decent amount of people aren't going to be able to afford a game. Parents will just assume that their kids' existing Switch 1 games will play on the system, like parents who may have bought a Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance with no games back in the day so that little Timmy had a shiny new way to play his existing Pokemon games on a slightly nicer screen than his DMG or Pocket. As I said, it's not actually quite as simple as that when it comes to back compat, and we'll cover that later. But that's what Nintendo want people to assume with their misleading quotes. Plays backwards compatible Switch 1 games is a very weasel-worded quote that is purposely misleading. But again, there's a whole other video in that, and I don't think we can, afford the time to get completely distracted. So, by having such high prices, and in the case of at least the accessories, I'd argue unnecessarily high prices, Nintendo are reducing the amount of games that will be sold at launch. And that is perfectly okay by them. It's probably what they want, because actually, selling a carry case for $85, a mostly hollow second dock for $120, or something like the Joy-Con straps or wheels for $14 and $25 respectively, despite them being plastic with no electronics, they actually are making far more money from the accessories than the launch window sales. And they don't have to worry about shortages of memory chips or the tariffs on importing those memory chips. And they know that once you have bought the console, and some accessories presumably, you are bound to buy more first-party games, at least later on down the line. It's actually good business for them, one could argue, to sell less games at the start if they can upsell on accessories and charge higher for the console. But this is screwing over all third-party publishers. If Nintendo is purposely not caring about how many games are sold immediately, it's very damaging to the third parties, and it means that launch window sales for third parties are likely to be very low, and there is a genuine chance that some of the 25 launch titles sold close to 0 copies. Like the quote in the Game Business article said, despite strong hardware sales, the sales for one third-party company were, quote, beyond our lowest estimates. It's disastrous. But outside of the cost, or at least running alongside the problem of cost, why else would someone not buy any games for the system? Ignoring scalpers, because I've already laid into them, but perhaps nothing in the launch lineup interested them, but they bought a system with a pre-order because they were afraid of scarcity, and they knew there would be eventually games that they wanted. But it's a lot of money to spend just based on an assumption that you might want to use it in the future. And anyone who knows Nintendo history knows that it's quite often that Nintendo will suddenly drop the price of the console just 6 months later or so if it's not selling well enough. I think a far bigger factor is another thing that unfortunately is entirely Nintendo's fault and very confusing. It's the fact that, as I mentioned in both my Mario Kart review and my First Impressions console hardware review, Nintendo made the system and games completely unplayable without a day one patch, and therefore made it impossible for even the most trusted of journalists or reviewers to review any games in the first few days. Usually, anyone even vaguely connected to the games industry can get review copies at least a week early to give them a chance to get their reviews out in time for the public to be fully informed about what games are available to buy when they hit the shelves. But no. This time around, launch day comes, 25 games are available, and there are 0 reviews. And no one has played them beforehand, except for a handful of people very briefly trying demos for a few minutes at invite-only preview events held by Nintendo. And even that isn't enough for any of them to put out a review of any kind, just give quick first impressions. Even though I personally managed to get a Switch 2 console 3 days early, I couldn't actually play Mario Kart till launch day. And after 3 days of playing, I put up my detailed review, but very much review in inverted commas because I was still forming an opinion and hadn't had enough time to play every single thing thoroughly. And therefore, unlike my Fast Fusion review, the only other game that I've recorded an in-depth review for so far, rather than just a quick overview, I didn't feel comfortable giving it a review score. Pretty much every reputable website did exactly the same thing, ongoing reviews without an attached score. And this is for Mario Kart, the flagship game, the one that everybody had to cover extensively. So what chance did the 21 third-party titles have of getting any attention from any reviewers in this time span? It beggars belief. Now, you might argue that reviews don't matter, especially as the majority of those third-party games are actually already available on other systems, which, by the way, is another factor on why maybe they sold less, but we'll cover that later too. But in the case of the Switch 2, having games available on other systems really doesn't matter. What people would have wanted to know is, how do the games play on the Switch 2, especially given how poorly many third-party games ran on Switch 1. It's not surprising that people would want to wait to hear that a game actually runs well before putting down the cash, especially with the elevated prices of $60 or even $70 for many of the titles. As an aside, I think a perfect example of this is the trailer, again in inverted commas, for Hogwarts Legacy. In the absence of reviews for the game, Warner Bros. Interactive did the only thing that they could and made sure that 100% of footage available when you searched for the game online was literal split-screen comparisons between the Switch 1 and Switch 2 versions to show that, unlike the first time around, the game actually looks okay and runs pretty well. Of course, they should have offered an upgrade path of some kind for those that bought the pretty appalling Switch 1 version, but considering how low sales figures are for third-party games on the Switch 2, I almost can't blame Warner Brothers for wanting to make the best out of a bad situation and at least get some income from their investment and Avalanche's hard work in porting the game. So let's talk about those physical retail copies. In my deep dive into all 25 launch titles, I pointed out that out of all of the games physically available, only 2 third-party games are actually on the cartridge. Cyberpunk 2077 Ultimate Edition, and Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma. Both games cost $70, which is pretty steep, more expensive than the expected third-party price of the last generation, but less than the $80 Nintendo is asking for Mario Kart or Tears of the Kingdom. And unlike those games, both Cyberpunk and Rune Factory include lovely packaging inside and out, color manuals and inserts, and aren't just empty boxes. I mentioned in both my Mario Kart review and the launch game lineups that Cyberpunk Physical Edition really puts Nintendo's own game to shame from a shelf collector value proposition sense. It's a really nice package. Now, I haven't bought it, and I didn't know too much about Rune Factory at the time I was making that video, so in my coverage I brushed over it fairly quickly, just mentioning that the developers should be commended for including the full game on the cartridge. But I had a really cool comment on one of my videos from a user on YouTube called Dialy. If you're listening, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And they pointed out that Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma includes a 31-page full-color manual, quote, because they like their players. Yeah, quite. That's awesome. And by the way, I actually do read and try to respond to every comment that people leave, whether positive or negative, so please do drop a comment. I will try my best to shout out anyone whose information or opinion that leads me to mention something in a future video. In this case, Dialy helped cement the developers and publishers Marvellous as a good company to watch out for, in my mind. And a few days ago, I was compiling a spreadsheet of all forthcoming confirmed games so that I know what to cover and when. And I noticed that in the whole 98 game lineup, there were only 2 more third-party games coming out later this year, which are confirmed to have the full game on the physical cartridge. Daemon X Machina, Titanic Scion, which I'm pretty interested in as it's a sequel to a Switch exclusive that I thought was super stylish and had a lot of potential, and Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar, which I'm also very interested in because Story of Seasons is the new name for the true Harvest Moon games. There was some copyright hijinks, and the games that now use the name Harvest Moon aren't the real Harvest Moon, if that makes sense. Many people say that Story of Seasons games are actually the better titles and the ones that you should support. I haven't played Harvest Moon or Story of Seasons games since the SNES original, but I did love that game back in the day. And since I got into both Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley during and after the pandemic, I've been interested in dipping my toes back into the Harvest Moon series and seeing how it progressed nowadays. Of course, quickly learning that the best way to do this is with Story of Seasons, not the new games that are called Harvest Moon. And that's when I noticed both of those games are being published by Marvellous, the same company that published Rune Factory. Basically, out of every game confirmed for the first year of the system's life, the only third-party games confirmed to actually have the full game on the cartridge are Cyberpunk from CD Projekt Red and 3 titles published by Marvellous. So I did a little digging, and I found the co-founder of Marvellous, Ken Berry, being interviewed by Mikhail Madna for RPG Site, and he said that he plans all their games to be on physical ROM cartridges in the West because, and I quote, "This is the right decision for us and our relationship with our fanbase. As a, quote, combination of personal preference and long-term business strategy." He says, "If someone like me, who's been in the industry for half of my life, can't tell the difference on which cases contain the physical game or not, I can only imagine how much more difficult it is for a non-industry person, especially if they are purchasing as a gift for someone else. And I never want anyone to have buyer's remorse after purchasing one of our retail games." Thank you. Thank you. And just like that, the company has put itself on my map as perhaps the best third-party publisher on the system, and certainly one that I want to support. And if one or more of the titles they are releasing is interesting to you, I highly recommend that you do too. I was already interested in 2 of the games, and now I will be picking up all 3. And thanks again to Daeli for leaving a comment that helped me make this connection. Really cool stuff, and honestly quite inspiring to me as a game dev and indie publisher. This is the way that I want to be. I've been developing games since the 1980s, but in the 2000s, I basically left the industry completely as the types of games that I liked to make were no longer viable at the time. I like small solo dev or micro team passion projects, 90s aesthetics, pixel art, arcade style gameplay, experimental and weird and wonderful ideas, unique narratives that say something, basically niche indie titles. For a while there, in the 2000s, that type of game couldn't really exist outside of Java mobile phone titles or Flash browser games, so I moved full-time into the film and TV side of the entertainment industry rather than becoming just one in thousands of people making models or textures for a yearly Call of Duty game or something. No hate towards those in that industry, but I just personally couldn't get excited about that from a creative standpoint. I grew up in the days of bedroom programmers in the UK, working on the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 or Amstrad CPC, and where a spotty teenager like me could actually make the next #1 best-selling game before they'd even left school. And many of those people went on to form massive companies in the future that are still around now. Companies like Rare, Codemasters, or even Rockstar. But I got out of the industry until COVID kind of pulled me back in. I wasn't able to work on movies during lockdown for obvious reasons, and a good friend was streaming games every night on Twitch. Stardew Valley, Minecraft, and other games. And as we were hanging out, I was thinking, hey, these are cool, unique passion projects, basically made by one dude. And I got thinking about how there was a renewed market for high-quality 16-bit pixel art style games, and a collector's market for physical small print run editions for the Switch, and how cool it would be to make a game for a Nintendo system. I was specifically hyped for the Switch, as I want to put out physical games with really nice packaging, full color manuals, posters, maps, stickers, maybe even special editions with player's guides, figurines, keyrings, plushies, something that I personally as a collector would want to own and display proudly on my shelf. And it seemed to me that the Switch was the no-brainer system to do this with. Of course, retro collectors, people with a passion for 90s style games, pixel art, beautiful, highly displayable cover art, etc., gravitate towards limited edition Switch physical editions. And I wanted to do that for Switch too as well. But it's hard, man. It's really hard work. Not making the games. That's hard, obviously. But releasing the games for Switch 2 is far harder than it needs to be. Of course, I'm under NDAs, as are all devs, and also I don't want to rip into Nintendo and anger them and perhaps mean my games won't even get approved in the first place because they think I'm a negative person or harming their business. That's the opposite of what I want. I'm one of Nintendo's biggest supporters, and I have been for 3.5 frickin' decades. And the only reason I got back into game dev in the first place is specifically because I wanted to release on the latest Nintendo system. It's just, with Nintendo only offering the 64GB card variants currently, they are forcing third-party devs to increase their prices, or go the game keycard route, or digital only, or just skip Nintendo entirely and just release on Steam and PlayStation and Xbox, where replication of a Blu-ray is literally a matter of pence. I know this because I do it regularly for movies. And when margins are steep enough for third parties and to sell at a reasonable price, they will be making less royalties than they would on other consoles, including the original Switch. Nintendo is making it even harder to sell decent numbers by nickel and diming the consumer so they have less money to spend, and increasing both the expected price of a game and the minimum manufacturing costs so that a small indie weird niche game like the ones I make have to be sold at a price that might be too much to interest most people. My plan, since starting to develop all of my games, was for them to release digitally for somewhere in the $7 to $15 range, and then have limited print runs of really nice, elaborate physical editions for, say, $20 to $35, depending on how much stuff is included in the packaging. I actually think it's important that digital games should be cheaper than physical games. To me, that's a no-brainer. I don't understand why Nintendo is trying to push the standard of physical and digital being the same price. There's been plenty of people online who've at least rumored that Nintendo insists that you release at the same price. And again, I'm under NDAs. But if so, that's ridiculous. So, yeah, what I think of as reasonable in my head for my games is $7 to $15 per digital, or physical copies for $20 to $35, depending on how much is in the package. And I think that's fairly standard. If you look at Switch 1 games, plenty of the smaller run editions, like, for example, limited run games or super rare games and things like that. Or I'm thinking like, the physical copies of things like Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, for example. They sell for around about $30, which is great for a physical copy. So I would only really want to charge more than that for really elaborate things, like maybe a very small run by a Kickstarter or something like that of maybe $60 or $70 for a big cardboard box with a plushie, a figurine, a full player's game guide inside, that kind of thing. That's been my vision all along and what has inspired me to keep working on my games. Yeah, we can do, if you just want to play the game, you can get it really reasonably digitally. If you want a physical copy for the shelf, there's a reasonable price. And if you really want to go all out and support me, then I'm going to make damn sure that you have some really, really cool stuff. And it's very limited edition, so it's likely to go up in value in the future. That's the kind of prospect that I think is how at least smaller indie games should sell. And on Switch 1, in general, that has been the case. But Nintendo is making it very difficult to do that with Switch 2. I can't get excited about just a digital-only release. I'm a collector, and I know how much that I personally value physical games, so I would be a hypocrite to go the digital-only route. But a $20 to $35 physical release, while perfectly possible on Switch 1, is not just unprofitable, but basically impossible on Switch 2 with the current state of releases. To be fair to Nintendo, game keycards aren't as terrible an idea as many people think. I know, dislike, but hear me out. There are definitely use cases where they 100% make sense. For example, massive AAA titles that are bigger than 64GB or require being permanently installed onto the system anyway to run because of the faster read speeds being necessary. This is the case with many physical games on PS5 and Xbox Series right now already, so Nintendo is somewhat just following the industry trend. Can't say that I like it, but it is the way the industry is going. And as they tend to be the same price for the game keycards as the digital download, in a way, you're getting a box for free. And the option to resell your game, or at least the license to download and play it while servers exist, which is obviously better than just having the download. Game keycards aren't as good as a physical cartridge, but they are better than just a standard download, and they're the same price. So I understand why some people think you shouldn't complain. But I can't help but feel that Nintendo refusing smaller games to have smaller and therefore cheaper capacity cards, while simultaneously increasing prices across the board, both as a third-party developer and equally as a long-term passionate collector who predominantly chose the Switch as their modern system of choice because of the physical collection aspect, I can't help but feel that I'm being screwed over. And I'm far from the only one. Now, this has already been a super long episode. There's a lot more to cover, and I'd like to break down the exact logistics, costs, and possible routes forward for third parties, including a more detailed look at game keycards, plus code in a box, cartridge size, upgrade paths for Switch 1 editions, backwards compatibility being viable or not, for new Switch 1 games being made for Switch 2 players in mind, looking at more real examples of the approaches being taken by existing third parties, including the biggest selling third party so far, for what that even means, given the disastrously low numbers, my old pal Sega. And also doing a deep dive into the digital-only download sales. Is it a better outlook for third parties there so far? So we know that the physical copies of third-party games are selling disastrously, maybe even not selling at all. But does that just mean that everybody has now gone, okay, no, let's just buy digital only, and the third parties are selling perfectly well digital only? Spoilers, not really. But there are some outliers. And once again, I'd point you in the direction of Fast Fusion, a truly excellent system exclusive available for just $15. Digitally, anyway. We also have that other quote from Matt Piscatella that I mentioned earlier, which I completely disagree with. And I respect his history of working in the industry at literally the top level. And he is obviously an intelligent guy, but this particular take that he gave is just so boneheaded and obviously wrong that I actually feel like he knows it's wrong and he's putting it out there to mislead as some kind of paid shill situation or just good intentions to try and help the industry or his friends, ? Now, I know, never attribute to malice what you can to incompetence, but Matt Piscatella is a very, very competent dude. So I got to give at least some side-eye here. We'll cover all that very soon in part 2, but for now, if you've listened all the way to the end of this epically long and quite depressing episode, thank you. Please consider dropping a like, subscribe, and maybe come and join our free members area, where I'm doing some fun official Nintendo toy giveaways, as I said, just at cost to me. It's just for fun. As I said earlier, there is no need to financially support. There's a free tier. I just want to grow a nice community of cool people, and you guys listening, liking, and commenting means the world to me and shows that I'm not just talking into the abyss, and getting what you can probably hear is a very sore throat from talking for so long. Once again, shout out to Shawn. I hope you don't mind the thumbnail, man. It's meant as a respectful homage. I did actually email it to you about 72 hours ago now, just in case you wanted to veto it. But if you're like me, you don't check your inbox often enough to have seen it in time, so sorry. And to everyone, I will link the GoFundMe for Shawn's stepdad in the description and the pinned comments on YouTube. So on the small off chance that you do have any spare money, despite these crazy times of $80 re-releases and $85 carrying cases, for frick's sake, please consider throwing it his stepdad's way rather than to me. I've recently gone through a similar kind of medical problem family-wise, and it's a terrible time. Terrible time. Come on. Thank you, everybody. And I'll catch you soon for part 2. Maybe we'll break it up by having a game review or Donkey Kong analysis or something fun in between. I want some positivity here. I'm not a Nintendo hater, despite what the comments like to try and tell me when I criticize things that should be criticized. I love Nintendo. Everyone go buy a Switch 2. I genuinely mean that. I want it to do well. Donkey Kong Bonanza looks amazing. I hate that there's all this negativity. It's not what I thought was going to happen with the launch of this system. But, you know, we'll ride it out. And as Shawn would say, later.